quiet group. Good morning. Good morning. Okay, good. So I'm going to speak to you about the process of transferring IPs in the APNIC region. Really, is it okay if you ask me questions during the session, or does it have to be?
Yeah, it's okay.
Do whatever you want. You're the speaker.
Okay. Okay, I don't mind interruptions, so feel free. Okay, so this is just my table of contents, and I'm going to go through it quickly, and then I'll cover each topic in depth during the presentation, so don't feel that I'm glossing over things here. There'll be details behind each of these topics. So the topics I'm going to cover are the purchase process, the need for IPv4 numbers, which really consists of three topics: how many IPs do you need, the business case, and the pre-approval process. Policy considerations, how to examine the seller's block, negotiation points, the asset purchase agreement, which is really the formal document between the buyer and the seller, the contract, if you will. And then we'll go into the escrow process, which is something that we like to use for payment between the buyer and the seller. And then a couple of topics that are kind of more opinions. One is the impact on the Apnic region, and then finally I'll talk about our point of view on transfers in the region. Oh, what did I do? Keyboard. How to get back to?
I'll get it back.
Oh, thank you. Wrong button. Okay. Okay, so this is the end-to-end purchase process. So what are the steps in the purchase process? And this is from the buyer point of view. So step one is to define the block size that you need. So that's, is there a pointer on this? Sorry.
Yes, the middle
Yeah,
button.
but it doesn't work with the brand.
Right here. To define the block size, the price you wish to pay, and the RIR you wish to purchase from. And again, this is just to show you a flow diagram, if you will, and then I have a slide on each of these, so again, I'm going to go into more detail. Then the next step is to get your pre-approval. Then what we do as a broker is we match the price you offer with the seller. And sometimes we're able to make a match, but sometimes if you, as a buyer, lowball, the seller won't match your price, and then what we do is we go to the next seller in our queue in terms of the order they come in, and we keep trying to make a match. Sometimes we can't make a match and you'll have to offer more money, and then sometimes we're able to make a match. The sellers will come down and say, okay, and it's a very negotiating kind of process. Once we make that match, down here on the bottom left, we bring the two parties under non-disclosure agreement. So this is to ensure the confidentiality of the discussions between the two parties. Then we slide over to the right here. The buyer gets an opportunity to examine the IP block belonging to the seller. And part of that examination is technical, and part of it is more legal, to look at the chain of ownership, make sure everything is in line from the legal point of view. We go up here, we do the asset purchase agreement, which is the legal document between the buyer and the seller. We arrange payment, which can be many different forms. One is the escrow agreement. We've done solicitor accounts, we've done direct payments where there's simple transfer of money after the transfer of the IPs. There's many ways that payment can be done. Up at the top, the transfer is made through the RIR from, which in this case is APNIC, from the seller to the buyer. We slide over to the right, and the IPs are announced by the buyer to ensure that everything is okay. If it's either a solicitor account or an escrow account, then you release the funds. If it's a straight transfer of funds, in other words, transfer from one bank account to another, then you do the transfer, and this is where payment is made. And the last step is any cleanup, things like documentation to finalize. It might be something like a bill of sale, an invoice. It might be just cleanup, anything that's in the closing conditions of the asset purchase agreement. So now I'm going to go into each of these steps in a little bit more detail. just to get you a sense of how this might work. Here we go. Okay, I'm getting better at this button on the PC thing. Okay, so the engineering function first. So determining how many IPs that you need. So the things that you would consider are your historical network growth, your customer growth rates, and then you would look at, you would kind of offset that by the pace at which you're converting to IPv6, things like how much can you NAT, and then on the bottom left there, if you have a rapid data center expansion, location expansion, or something that might require more IPv4 than under normal circumstances. The middle section is how do you get internal budgetary approval? That's always a difficult thing. So once you've got your raw numbers, you go and you get your dollars set aside internally. And what does that depend on? So it depends on the block size being acquired. So I'm talking here really about the price. So the bigger the block size, usually the lower the price. So if you want to acquire something like a /20, you're going to pay more per IP than if you acquire a /16. And we find that that's because it's really more work for the seller per IP. Now, the second factor is how clean are the IPs? As you may know, there are a lot of things going on the internet, and sometimes IPs get blacklisted. If you want to buy blacklisted IPs, they're much cheaper than if you buy clean, never used IPs, and most people want clean, never used IPs. So you tend to want to pay a little bit more for that. The originating RIR, my finding is that in the Apnic region, you tend to want to pay a little more for Apnic-based IPs because the transfer process is a little bit cleaner if you stay within your own RIR as opposed to if you acquire them from ARIN. And I listed some sample prices here so you can see what you're dealing with. Right now, ARIN-based IPs are probably on the order of 10% cheaper, I think, than Apnic-based IPs. And that could change because there are not very many IPs left in the Apnic region. They're a very short supply kind of item. And then finally, Apnic pre-approval. I have a couple of slides on that coming to show the process you go through to get pre-approval from Apnic. Okay, so I've got a fairly detailed example here on getting approval and determining how many IPs. Yes?
Good morning. You had said we should interrupt you with questions, so
Please
I thought
do.
I would.
Please do.
My name is Lee Howard. I'm from Time Warner Cable.
Heidi.
When you, in the determining how many addresses you should get, I don't remember off the top of my head the justification time that is allowable in APNIC. Is there a specific time period that you should consider how many addresses you need to last you for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? You did say as your IPv6 program or NAT program is ramping up. Any guidance or observations?
Yeah, on this slide, this actually shows it. The period is 24 months.
Thank you.
Okay, and this example is, it's a little bit hokey as any example is, but it kind of shows the kind of numbers you would try to run through. And anything when you look into the future is you're kind of estimating your needs. But hypothetically, so here's a company and they have 40,000 IPs today. So that's this number right here. And they're using 30,000 today. And they have 2 data centers, one in Singapore and one in Hong Kong. And they plan growth at these 2 locations for 2 purposes, say for data center and for cloud and managed services kind of things. So I'm going to take it through the first year, and then what I'll do is, if you can get a copy of the slides, which I think Sunny said you could, you can take a look at the numbers for the next 2 years. So the one I'll run through is for the rest of 2013. So what we're going to do is we're going to say there's 50% growth in Singapore, 150% growth in Hong Kong. So today, based on the needs, so they have new data center needs of 40,000 IPs and 10,000 IPs in Hong Kong, and that brings them to a total of 60,000 and 20,000. And then for managed services and cloud, they need an extra 50% on top of that. So 50% of 60 is another 30, takes them to 90, and 150% growth in Hong Kong. So 150% of 20,000 is 30,000 more, takes them to 50. 90 plus 50 is 140,000. So you can see how I've done these calculations, and that takes them to a shortfall of 100,000. 140 minus 40 is 100. So I do the same thing in the next 2 years, and I arrive at an overall shortfall by June of 2015 of 3.65/16s. So what they could do hypothetically is they could, they take this as their business case to APNIC, and they say, okay, I need up to 3.65/16s over the next roughly 2 years. And what they would probably do then is they would say, okay, I'm going to seek pre-approval for up to, say, 3/16s. In actually making a purchase, what we find most companies do is they don't purchase 3 right up front. They would purchase 1 or 2, and they would see how things go, and just have the pre-approval sitting in the wings. That's normally what companies do. And then what we often do with them is we'll say, okay, they'll come to us and they'll maybe purchase 1/16, and quite often companies will say, we'd also like an option to buy a second /16 at the same price. Will you hold that option for us for 3 to 6 months? And we see a lot of these options in contracts when they do the asset purchase agreement. So that's a good way to sort of lock in a price for the future. So when you do your business case, the things you need to consider are the costs. So I'm sticking with my hypothetical example, and I'm saying that the cost is roughly between $9 to $9.15 per IP. And when I did this example a month or so ago, it was we had just done one at $9.15. So it's roughly around $600,000 US for a /16. And a lot of times people want to know what are the transfer costs. The Apnic website has a very wonderful calculator for calculating the costs of transfer, and it varies per block size transferred. So this transfer cost is for a /16, and it's $1,925 per /16 Australian dollars. And then you would build in the benefit side, and it can be any number of factors. It could be new services, new customers that you're planning to acquire. Sometimes it's avoidance of losses if you don't acquire the block. And it could even be some kind of new business growth that would otherwise not be possible without the IPs. Now in terms of the pre-approval, I'm only going to show a couple of screenshots here. The first thing is on this particular slide is whether the IPs are for your internal network or whether you're an ISP. And the second slide starts to get into additional questions on timing, block size, and justification. I've consulted to a couple of companies doing these pre-approvals, and it's very helpful to do network diagrams and growth projections and so on when you're doing these pre-approvals. Now, policy considerations, to Lee's question a little bit more. Once you get your pre-approval, there's a few policy considerations. So first of all, you can use your pre-approval for these transfers from either Apnic or from ARIN. And one factor to consider is that when you transfer from ARIN, the process can take on average, I would say, 2 weeks longer. And we had one extreme case, just to show the value of Apnic IPs. We had one extreme case where ARIN disputed a legacy IP transfer and delayed the process for 4 months. So the Apnic purchaser had to wait 4 months for their IPs before they released them. And even though the lawyers on the ARIN side, provided the justification, ARIN likes to get their claws, so to speak, into the legacy holders' IPs, and it just took that long. The Apnic pre-approval, as I said, is good for 24 months, and when you get the pre-approval, 80% of your current IPs have to be in use, and the need is based on 24 months of usage. Okay, so examining the seller's block There's a lot of things to think about. And one thing we suggest is that you get a history of the block in terms of how long has the seller had the block and what have they used the block for. And quite often the blocks haven't been used in a long time, haven't been announced in a long time, and that may not matter. We've run into blocks from Erin that have been hijacked even though they haven't been used. So you want to look at other things besides what the seller's done with them. You should check whether they've been emailed on, because if they've been hijacked, you'll see that they've been emailed on, and they could have been blacklisted recently. There are websites you can look at to see if they've used by senderbase.org. You can take a look at things like that to see if they've been emailed on. So there's a lot of things to look at, and not just the history with the registered owner themselves. You also want to check that from a legal point of view, that the RIR listing dovetails with the ownership information that you're given. So that's more from a legal point of view, so that when you do the transfer, everything's going to work out. And then after purchase, when you arrange the announcing of the IPs, in case you have any issues, you want to work through them with the seller. So lots of things there to think about. Okay, negotiation points. This is the fun part for everybody, I hope. It's very interesting too from our point of view. So the main points of negotiation that we run into are price, payment method, payment terms, and the legal venue. So the price is going to depend on the block size, as I said. The smaller the block, usually the higher the price. Not always, but usually. You know, I have seen a /18 go for a lower price than a /16, so it doesn't always hold water, but usually. The payment method, as I said, varies from direct payment, where you just do a cash transfer from account to account. But we also see escrow, we see solicitor accounts, we see bankers trust, we see lots of vehicles. And then payment terms, it can be deposit in advance if you use escrow or solicitor accounts, or it can be at close if you do a transfer, or it can be something like net 30 days if, you know, some people will do by a purchase order and transfer 30 days after the transfer of the IPs. And in Asia, we see probably 95% of the time we see Singapore as the most frequent legal venue. Do we have a question? Okay. And next slide. Okay, the asset purchase agreement. So I think this, when you download the slides, this will give you a pretty good idea of what the APA looks like. So the first thing it does at the top of the agreement is identify the buyer and the seller. Who are they? You know, the date of the agreement and so on. Then it will define the block being purchased and the purchase terms. So it's quite structured at the beginning of the document. And then the next part of the document, you know, there's many parts to it, but the second most important part, I think, is the transfer process. So the main thing here, I think, is to define the steps to be taken. This makes it clear who is responsible for what, in what order, and lastly, when is the transfer complete. So if you look at Part G here, you know, upon receipt of the notice that this transfer is complete. You know, when you download the slides, this will give you a pretty good idea of some of the main parts to the APA. I wanted to talk a little bit about escrow. I find that in the APNIC region that many buyers and sellers are not familiar with escrow, and it's very, very common in North America and quite common in Europe. Very common in Europe, I would say. So, but not so much in Asia. And we like to use escrow as the financial vehicle because it pretty much guarantees the safe payment for both the buyer and the seller. And what happens is there's a separate escrow agreement from the asset purchase agreement where the buyer would, before the transfer of the IPs, deposit the funds into an escrow account. And then following the transfer of the IPs, the buyer and seller would agree that the transfer took place, and then the funds would be released from the escrow. Now, if for some unforeseen reason, the transfer did not go through, and we have never seen this in the Apnic region, the funds would be returned to the buyer. So it's very safe for both parties. So we like it very much. Now, just a couple of perspective slides. First of all, the impact of trading on the region. I wanted to say that the first point is that I think it makes IPs available to entities that couldn't otherwise get numbers at this time. And secondly, we're finding that the volume of trade so far has been low. I think probably due to the fact that prices are relatively high so far. But right now, just in the past couple months, we're starting to see an acceleration of requests for IPs. So it may be that the stockpiles or the number of IPs that companies had are starting to run out, and they're starting to have more needs. Prices have fallen. You'll recall the Microsoft Nortel trade that was highly publicized a couple of years ago was at 11 3/4. And it's very high compared to the $9 or so we're seeing now for the same quantities. And I think price definitely depends on the circumstances. We're seeing that dip. And I don't want to predict where prices will go in the future, but that's the current situation. And my last point is Apnic suppliers are very scarce. And I think that in this region soon that only Aaron's suppliers will be available to buyers. And I'd like to close, I think, just with my perspective a little bit on the marketplace. So first of all, what I'm seeing in Aaron region is that there are quite a few sellers, and what I run into is when we talk to prospective sellers is it has to be worth their while to free up their IPs for sale. I've run into several companies, a couple of large companies who say, I won't do it for less than $6 or $7 per IP. If you run into the very small company that doesn't really have much going on, and they're struggling a little bit and need the cash flow, they'll do it for $7 or $8. But if you run into a company that's doing very well, they just won't bother. So there has to be sort of a price threshold where it's worthwhile. I'm also seeing that the larger companies that have the /8s, they're holding out for a higher price. I've talked to many of them, and they're saying, I won't do it for less than $12. I'm going to wait and see. And, the /8 holders, they want to get top dollar for their /8. It surprises me a little bit that they are sort of, some aren't cashing in now, but we'll wait and see what happens with that. I find that buyers still sometimes have distrust in the process, that they find it hard to believe that if they hand over the cash, they're going to get the IPs and they're going to be transferred to them from another company or another entity, so to speak, that they're used to getting them from the RIR, so how can it be that they're getting them from a company in this case? We've done it, we've done over 50 transactions where we've transferred IPs from company to company in the 3 regions. And I can tell you that it's happened legally every time, and they've gone from one company's name or entity's name to the other entity's name, and it does work. And the things just to be sure of are that you've got the legitimate legal documents that prove it, that you've got a legitimate seller, that you've got that proof of the custody of the IPs, that you've got a safe payment method, that there's not any monkey business around how you pay, and that the transfer process itself is well coordinated. And if those things are in place, it's a perfectly safe process. And my last point is that just to give you a perspective on what's happening in the rest of the world, we're seeing right prices at about 10, sometimes 20% higher than here in Apnic. And I think that's because Apnic has access to the huge pool of IPs in Aaron region, and RIPE does not. And I don't know what will happen to change the equilibrium of prices, but it could be that once RIPE opens up the market to Aaron region as well, we'll see a common price line across the board, and it'll be a little lower in RIPE region. but right now it's a little higher in Wright Region than the rest of the world. So those are my closing remarks, and I'd be really glad to take extra questions.
Hi, Dean Pemberton, Internet NZ. Wow. So that's quite a process, right? So you've laid out the flow chart, and there's documents and all that sort of stuff. Wow. So we buy and sell things all the time. You know, some things, companies, houses, property, we like to have a lot of surety about. We like to get the lawyers involved. We like to have sale and purchase agreements, just like the ones that you had on the screen. Sometimes we have escrow. You know, different things we buy. Cars, probably in the middle. We do like to do some checking that the person selling me the car is the legitimate owner of the car. But I didn't need a lawyer and a sale and purchase agreement last time I bought a car. Smaller things again, groceries. When I went to my greengrocer, I didn't need them to prove that the apple I was buying, they were the legal owner of the apple, yet I was still able to buy it and go home and eat it. How did we decide that IP addresses were in the first bit, rather than anywhere in the last?
You should be asking her, you should be asking APNIC.
I agree. So the question is not necessarily here, it's just how did we decide that there was so much distrust, whereas you yourself said you'd never seen a sale go wrong? How did we decide that there was so much of a problem here that we needed the big function rather than any version of the smaller function?
Okay, my answer to that is this, that as a broker, I only represent a seller, and I don't accept payment from the buyer, and I provide all of the paperwork and the legal assurity to both parties. And I find that as a buyer, I want you to come to me more than once to buy through me. In theory, you should not have to hire a lawyer externally. If you have an in-house lawyer, I find that you often have your in-house lawyer review the documents, but I've had many lawyers go through our documents. And I believe very strongly that the things I give to you as a buyer you will be very assured that your process will go well and you'll get your IPs without hiring a lawyer or without paying me a dime. Only the seller will pay me.
But why is it that I need them? What is it about IP addresses that means I need all of this surety and all of this checking where, when I buy a car, I don't have to go back through the entire car's history and find out all this sort of stuff. I just buy it, right?
Well, I personally think in this region it's cultural. I find that many North American buyers don't bother to hire lawyers. Many don't. But at the same time, it is a legal agreement so that you're assured of getting your IPs.
Right.
And you're spending, if you're buying a /16, you're spending, between $500,000 and $600,000.
Sure.
So it's up to you. So I believe it's the size of the purchase.
Right.
When you're buying a car, you're not spending $600,000 usually.
Well, that really depends on the car.
Yes.
Randy Bush, IJ. Dean, I think we did it.
Yeah.
I don't think she did it.
No.
I think APNIC, Wright, Aaron, Apnic, Apnic made enormous bureaucratic processes. Aaron is bloody run by lawyers, or one lawyer, and so on and so forth. And so we put in a process that, and this is historic, and we've discussed it before, that assumed distrust of the applicant for IP addresses. Those people are trying to take our addresses without justification. We make them file papers, they want to do a transfer, they want to change their company or sell to another company. We make them go through enormous bureaucratic processes with lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. So a broker is caught in the middle. Okay, and of course, since they're trying to be paranoid about the whole thing, they add another layer. But we injected the poison in the first place.
Steve Kent, BBM. To your point, Dean, in fact, in the U.S., one of the popular things is if you are buying a used car, you go to some place called Carfax to find out the provenance of the car. Because we worry about these sorts of things. But I think the mere fact that you're dealing with something in the 6-digit price range suggests that a reasonable level of background checks, et cetera, are appropriate, and then we get to debate what reasonable is.
Lee Howard, Time Warner Cable. I was going to say exactly that, but I was also going to say that at my company, we don't buy a stapler without a lawyer looking at the purchase agreement. It's a large company, and of course with this kind of money, and you don't know where these addresses have been, yes, you want somebody to check to make sure that you do have redress.
Hi, I'm Sandra, I'm working for SoftBank, and I have a comment and question about the geolocation issue.
Yes.
In my understanding, almost all IP have some kind of geolocation issue.
Yes.
So it's not so easy to avoid this issue in the transaction among different countries. Okay. Also, Also another problem is it's not so clear who is operating geolocation issue, like geolocation service right now. So my question is there any good way, a good solution, or good way to avoid this issue?
So I am not technically inclined to solve that, but I can tell you we ran into one case where we had a Singapore buyer and a Hong Kong seller, and they were able to fix the problem within about 2 weeks, and it affected, they told me afterwards, it affected about 2 users before they solved it. So yes, it is a problem, but I think now that we know that it happens, we can fix it in advance of the transfer. But yes, you are right, it happens. I think the technical staff know how to solve it.
Steve Kent, BBN. In response to your question, in fact, there is work underway to augment the WHOIS database with geolocation information, and maybe Daniel wants to talk about what's happening at RIPE in that regard, specifically because address space holders would like to be able to let the world know where most, if not all, of their subscribers are, so that language issues, et cetera, are taken care of.
I think